All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, OSINT for AppSec, Recon NG, and beyond. I made sure I put and beyond in there because I definitely don't want to harbor a misconception that you can do everything in OSINT and Recon NG. It's not your 100% silver bullet. It was meant to definitely accelerate the process and automate a lot of the things that you used to have to do manually. But there are some things that we do above and beyond Recon NG to really build our open source intelligence products. And so that's why that and beyond is there. And of course, here I'm talking about how it applies to application security. So who am I? I'm the managing consultant over at Invisium. So I run all of our commercial services out of Invisium. We are a software security company. That means mobile applications, web applications, thick client applications, all that kind of stuff. So if you're in need of that type of service, we'd certainly appreciate it if you would consider us to be your consultants. I'm a hacker looking out for users by training sometimes developers, sometimes you guys, and then most of the time just anybody that'll listen to me, because I love to talk and I like when people listen. Otherwise I just feel awkward. It's like I'm talking to a mirror. I love to write code. I love Jesus, and as you can see, I also love my church. Shout out to New Spring in South Carolina and Pastor P. I also love to drive fast, and I always get caught. Like, I never get away with it. I'm that guy that, like, even I'll flash my military ID, you know, I'll have, like, the sheriff sticker on the back. I never get a warning. I'm always walking away with a ticket. So, caution, live demos ahead. Not as many as I wanted to do, simply because if I did, I'd be here for about 4 hours. So, as always, when I do live demonstrations with OSINT, offensive material is possible, and while I don't condone it, I can't prevent it. If I did, I wouldn't be doing any demos, and that wouldn't be any fun. So if you've seen any of my previous talks, you know that I don't look at Recon NG as being a tool written by one person. Yeah, I maintain the core of the framework, but there are a lot of people involved in contributing modules and code and things of that sort. And specifically to this talk, some of the elements I'm going to be talking about, these folks were involved in that. Brian Furman's actually here sitting in the back. Michael Hoffman's typically here. I'm not sure if he's made it to DerbyCon this year, but you know, all these gentlemen here, including in the whole offensive security group, I'll talk more about why here in a little while. But yeah, these folks here, give them a follow, give them a shout out, because if it wasn't for them, a lot of the material in this particular talk wouldn't exist. And so this is my third year talking about OSINT, I think at DerbyCon. And the landscape's changed a lot. You know, I've always talked about how all these new technologies, new resources become available for us to harvest information from. And also my kind of trajectory in my career has changed. I used to do a lot of NetSec stuff where a lot of this OSINT was geared towards, but I've since moved on to Invisium, where now I'm doing application security 100%. And so most of what I've talked previously about OSINT has been kind of related to NetSec, and I figured, you know, I've had to come up with a whole new methodology about how I approach open source intelligence gathering now that I focus on AppSec solely. And so I was like, you know, I'm going to share my methodology, kind of show people how I do it. Because I talk to a lot of AppSec folks that are like, you know, when I have source code or if I'm doing application security, I just don't see the need for spending much time on open source intelligence. And so we're going to try to answer that question for you. So what good is OSINT for an AppSec assessment when you already have the source code? Now, that's not always relevant, but it is at Invisium, because most of the time, probably 80 to 90% of our engagements, we have source code. We are a company that's bug-focused, not threat-focused. So we're looking for every single vulnerability in the application, not just the ones that let us penetrate the environment or penetrate to a specific goal that's been outlined for us in a penetration test. So that's a legitimate question. And I'll concede one thing right up front, and that the darker the assessment is, the greater the need for open source intelligence. Now, what I mean by darker is, I think most of us have heard of black box versus white box testing. And so the closer you get to black box, the more useful a lot of this open source intelligence is going to be, but it's not a zero-sum game. Because even if you're doing white box or you're doing source code analysis, you still need OSINT, or you can still use OSINT products to help show risk. And the bottom line is, whether you're doing a penetration test or a vulnerability assessment, whether you're doing a dynamic test or a source code analysis, the goal is the same. Ultimately, we want our client to fix problems in code, right? We want to fix problems in their applications. And so, how do we do that? Well, we do that by showing risk. So by showing impact, right? Impact is the key to making intelligent risk decisions. All right? So static analysis shouldn't change how we show impact. right? We can still use the OSINT products along with vulnerabilities that we find in code to show attack patterns and say, well, an attacker can do this with the information they got here through this particular vulnerability. So it doesn't necessarily change how we show impact. It just gives us more information to write actionable recommendations. Because now we have code. We can say, okay, here's a patch to fix your problem. Okay, but the idea is the same. We want people to fix bad code. Okay, so somebody read the slide for me. Somebody, okay, come on, somebody. You know, sir, I'm super glad you asked, because that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the day, right? All right, so if you've seen my previous talks, you know that, I quite often approach OSINT as kind of a flow. Like I go for one piece of information first, and then I move it on to the next segment, and then I transform it into something else, and it kind of goes in a flow. Well, one thing that I've kind of seen with when I'm collecting information for AppSec is it's not so much a flow of information, it's just different categories of information that I'm after. And so there's not a specific flow you have to go in, but different categories of information that we're chasing. And so what I've done here with this particular talk today is we'll talk about the different categories of information. We'll talk about what I'm looking for, why I'm looking for that specific information, and then we'll talk a little bit about how I go get that information, then hopefully get some good demonstrations in. So the first category of information I want to talk about are contacts. Okay, so what am I looking for when I'm talking about contacts? Well, usernames and email addresses. And sometimes email addresses are usernames. Okay, well, why am I looking for that stuff? Well, they open up certain attack patterns within application security that I see all the time coming across in reports done by Invisium and reports done by other consulting firms. And those attack patterns are as follows. User enumeration. So if I've got a user enumeration flaw and I've got valid usernames, well, in most cases I've seen people do anti-automation very, very poorly. It's a difficult problem to solve. And then weak password policies, we see that rampant everywhere, right? I mean, how many people here do consulting engagements regularly where they report weak password policy? I mean, I think on every single application it almost needs to be a template that's already built into the report because it's just bad. It's a valid problem. Okay, well, having usernames opens that attack pattern, right? Because if we can guess a username and they're not doing anti-automation properly, well, there's a good chance we can guess their password, and we do this quite frequently to gain access or authenticated access to applications. Also, what about account lockout? Right? This is also another difficult problem to solve, and it's rarely done right. It's typically done wrong. And if it's not done right, if I can enumerate users and you're doing account lockouts poorly, then quite often it can result in what we call a user-level denial of service vulnerability, where I just systematically lock out accounts. As a penetration tester, I may not always do that because it defeats the purpose, but this is a way that we can show impact, we can show risk to the organization. Okay, so how am I going to go about getting this information? Well, for those of you that are new to Recon NG, I've got some search functionality built in there. And I'm actually going to bounce out real quick because I want to kind of show you this, walk you through it briefly. Whoa, I just completely lost my place, didn't I? Let me go back to this. Okay. So if we start Recon NG, and I'm going to load a snapshot because I'm sure I've boogered up some data since the last time. For those of you that didn't know, Recon NG does snapshots. It does snapshots, right? So you can take snapshots of your database at any point in time during the OSINT process, and then go back to it if you mess it up at a later when you're running a later module or something like that. But in any case, if you do like a show modules, you'll see that every module has within its path something along these lines. What that means is the data that goes into the module and the data that we're trying to get out of the module. So say you've got an OSINT project or you're conducting OSINT against a target and all you have is a domain. Well, you add the domain to the database and then you do a search domains dash and it'll show you all the modules that take the domain as input. And then you can kind of see what you're going to get out of it. So say I have a domain, so I do a search domains dash. Those are all the Recon modules that start with domains and result in something else. Well, in this particular case, we're looking for contacts, right? So we can do search dash contacts, and notice the dash is before this time because we're trying to get to contacts. Hit enter, and these are all the modules in Recon NG that result in contacts. So what are a couple that I'm particularly interested in right now? Well, first, Sales Maple. So what is Sales Maple? So one of the, and you've heard me talk about PwnList before if you've seen any of my previous talks. One of the original founders of PwnList left the company in the past year. And what he did was he had this goal in mind that he wanted to create a new Jigsaw. For those of you that didn't know what Jigsaw was, it was an online CRM that was awesome for harvesting contact information about people. They got bought out or converted over to data.com under, I think it was Salesforce. And then it's been a game of cat and mouse on trying to scrape their data. Now they put it behind an authentication wall. And they've just not been very friendly about sharing data. And you can't necessarily blame them. But we want that data, right? Well, this guy was like, that data should be free. So he's made it his goal to create a new Jigsaw where all of that information is accessible, except now including the email addresses. All right, so we no longer have to try to build email addresses off of first names, last names, whatever. Email addresses are freely available through SalesMaple. So let me add a domain, and I'm going to go ahead and just use my church because they got a pretty good target, and they've done a decent job of cleaning things up, so no one will be embarrassed by me using them. Say that again? Sure I can. How about that? There we go. So show domains. I can see I got one in there. Run it. Going out to SalesMaple, pull it down. You can see I get first names, I get last names, and then I get full email addresses, right? So now I don't have to build email addresses. That's kind of nice. So SalesMaple is something that I've added recently that's definitely worth taking a look into. The guy that created this thing is also like specifically come to me and said, I want the security community to use this. I'm not going to build it up and then all of a sudden put a paywall in front of it. This is something that's going to be accessible to the security community, so that's why I feel pretty freely about marketing his stuff. There's Mail Tester. Mail Tester is a module that will validate email addresses for you. So now that we have email addresses in the system, we could load Mail Tester and run it, and it'll actually go out, use SMTP protocol and DNS to make sure there's a mail server there, and then talk to the mail server to validate that the email address actually exists. And then it'll remove it from the database if it doesn't. So it's not a perfect science because you can lock down your mail servers to not respond, to not give that information through SMTP. But in most cases, it's pretty successful. NewSpring prevents this, and so demoing it won't actually do us any good. Okay, and then scraping metadata from files. Who here has ever used? Is it MetaGoofil? Is that what it is? Anybody here ever used MetaGoofil? I know. I got okay. A couple folks use MetaGoofil. Basically, what it does is it goes like a Google search and tries to enumerate all the public-facing XML-based and OLE-based documents and PDFs that are associated with a domain, and then it scrapes all the metadata out of them. Well, there's like a whole bunch of dependencies for MetaGoofil, and if you're not using Kali, then it takes some setup. Well, I built it into Recon NG. Okay, so let's load Metacrawler, and I'm using the smart load feature. Don't know what that is, then check out some of my previous videos. But I load Metacrawler, and then it would go show options here. We see the source, obviously, is the same domain. And then extraction set to true. Well, let me set extract to false and run it. And real quick, if you set extract to false, it's just going to come back and say, hey, these are all the documents that I found on websites that are associated with that particular domain. Pretty cool. Now let's see what kind of information we can get from that. So let's set extract to true. And now when I set extract to true, I am now bridging the gap from passive reconnaissance to active. So I want to make that very clear because we're actually going to reach out to those web servers and pull down those files. So now we're actively touching the environment. It's an important distinction to make. By default, this module is set to false so that you just see the files, and then you can you can go out and grab them yourself, or you can use this module to move forward. Make sure, just remember, it's not passive any longer at this point. So run it, pulls down the file, starts extracting metadata. The cool kind of information you get from that, well, you're going to get quite often usernames, actual username on the internal systems. Quite often you'll just get the names of the people, so the account name versus the username. You'll get the computer name quite often on the network that made it, the software that created it, so now you get an idea of what software they're running inside. So a lot of neat information that you won't get anywhere else you can extract from metadata within files. And so basically, yeah, this is what Metacrawler looks like. I don't have it storing anywhere into the database at the moment simply because the three different file types, the OLE, XML, and PDF file types that I'm parsing, they're not consistent in terms of the names of the data fields. And so right now I just got it printing out to the screen, something I'll probably change moving forward, but I just put this together yesterday, so yeah. I'm working on it's a work in progress, okay? Yeah, while you guys were enjoying the party, I was up in the room coding. Okay, so the next category of information I'm looking for, profiles. Okay, what am I looking for here? Well, social media profiles, public or private. I'm lumping everything into social media. So something like Keybase.io, where you have a public-facing profile, I'm just calling it social media, okay? Anywhere you've got a public-facing profile. And private's still relevant because just because it's set to private doesn't mean we can't friend them, right? It doesn't mean we can't connect with them and then unprivatize that information and access it. So public and private social media profiles. Why? Well, it opens up some other attack patterns, kind of like our contacts did. User enumeration, once I have a username, right? If they've got no anti-automation in place, which is either done wrong or quite often doesn't exist at all. And then any type of in-band password reset system, often this type of attack pattern can be exploited. How many folks here run into in-band password reset processes fairly frequently? I do. What I mean by that is like, answer these security questions and then we'll let you reset your password without sending you an email. We see this quite often. Case in point, recently I was doing an assessment of a Fortune 300 company, just top 300 of the Fortune 500, right? And they had a single sign-on portal for everything. It was a single sign-on portal for everything that used in-band password reset, and it was via security questions. And they also had user enumeration in the login page. So I was able to enumerate some users, go out on the internet, harvest some people, just like I've done in previous demonstrations, and harvest and validate some users via the user enumeration. But when you validate the user, obviously it's going to show you the security questions. They were using like 5 or 6 random security questions, but what I found is that if you just kept on asking for the same person, eventually you could enumerate all their security questions. So I did that for, 5 or 10 people, and started looking through the security questions and said, well, these look like they're probably pretty easy to guess. Well, what high school did I go to? The name of my dog, I think were a couple of them. And I didn't need to answer all 5 or 6, I just need to answer 2, because I could keep requesting it until it asked me just those 2 questions, right? So found their Facebook profile. This person's Facebook profile, went out there, started doing some harvesting. Sure enough, there was a photo that said, oh, look at my cute puppy so-and-so, right? Dog's name, got it. What high school did I go to? Well, Facebook tells you what high school people go to. I think it may have been the mascot, right? And so I just looked up the high school, found out the mascot, went back to the authentication page, put it in a few times, varying capitalization, eventually changed her password. Right now I've got access to the SSO system. She wasn't an admin, but once I got inside the system, they had a user lookup function where you could look up everybody else in the company, and guess which field was there? Username, right? So then I could say, well, this guy is a systems administrator, and this is his username. Let's go back to the password reset system and do the same thing for him. And then eventually I have user access to an administrative account. This kind of stuff happens. This is not, this is, and for those of you that have heard Chris Gates or Rob Fuller give talks before, that's low to pwn, AppSec style, right? I mean, that's just what it is. Because most times you see those 3 vulnerabilities, you're like, low, medium, low, not high impact. Well, guess what? There's some pretty high impact when you chain them together. And profiles gives us the ability to do that. So how we do this? Well, a couple of ways. I used to have a LinkedIn crawl module, and that's all it was. And I think somebody here mentioned it earlier, the LinkedIn crawl module. And basically what it did is it would use Bing to harvest LinkedIn profiles, and then it would go to the profile, and it would go to the others viewed this profile. You guys, anybody seen that on LinkedIn on the right-hand side? It said others that viewed this profile. Well, it would crawl that. And it would check for each employer of those people, and it would just keep doing that for every person that validated was an employee of that particular company. And then once it was done, it would add all those people to the contacts table. Well, I was like, let's split this up. In fact, Brian Furman's the one that wrote this, wrote the original module. And I said, hey, Brian, why don't you split this up into 3 different things? Because now we can use Bing to populate profiles table. And then we can take the profiles table to crawl LinkedIn to get more profiles, and then just have a separate module take all those profiles, turn them into contacts. He's done all that work, and I'm telling you, it is the most effective contact harvesting method within Recon NG. It's amazing. For those of you that haven't used it, I encourage you to use it. It takes a little while to run, but that sucker will come back with more contacts than any other module or set of modules in the framework. There's also a module called Profiler. If you've seen my previous demos, you've heard me talk about name check, which allows you to put in your username or your handle or whatever, and it will go to 136 different resources and tell you whether or not your username exists there. Well, guess what we can use that for, right? We can go and say, well, hey, where is this? I got this particular target. Where does this person have a profile on the internet? enumerate all the different places they have a profile, go there, harvest information. Well, Profiler does that for over 200 different sites. He's Mike, this is from Micah Hoffman, a web breacher. He expanded the target set to beyond just social media to things like previously Ashley Madison and some of the more unmentionable places that you certainly wouldn't want your people to have accounts at. But he did that because he's a threat intelligence guy. And so it's a really good resource to go find information about where people have profiles. And then the Facebook directory. Show of hands if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, the guy in my class. 2 guys in my class. All right. So let me show this to you. Anybody seen, oh, really? Facebook, you think I'm a bot? What is that? Is that an H? Okay. Anybody seen this? Obviously, I've been scraping Facebook. Yeah, you just like take a person's name and you just drill down until you have a list of everybody with that name, right? And then you have their public profile. Now, most people don't know about this. John Pullen, a guy that works for me up at Avisium, was like, hey, you should check this out. I'm like, heck yeah, this is awesome. I started writing a module around this. It's still pretty buggy. I think one of the reasons why maybe they haven't publicized it all that much is because it's got some bugs in it. But I'm in the process of writing a module for it so that you can it'll take just people's names and it'll whittle down and say, here are all the profiles associated with that name. All right, pretty handy stuff. Okay. Let me see if I can get my slides to show back up. Here we go. All right, so next thing I'm talking about, or I'm looking for, next category I'm looking for is breaches. Okay, what am I trying to find in breaches? This is like breach data, right? What am I looking for? Well, I'm looking for usernames and password sets. Credentials. Credentials rock, right? I mean, we all love credentials. You've seen the Pwn list demos. It's amazing the kind of information you can get out of that. And then breach details. And why are breach details important? Well, they're important because we can find areas of weakness, right? If we know that a particular breach at a company occurred because they had rampant SQL injection in an application, well, the developers might have problems understanding how to code securely around SQL injection, and we can definitely hone in on that and other applications on the same domain or owned by the same company. And in credentials, well, why are those important? Well, password reuse, right? Password reuse is rampant. And also pattern analysis is something I came across recently. Say, like, you do Pwn lists and you see somebody last October, right, had a password of capital AUTUMN 14. Like a month ago in July, what would you have guessed their password was? Anybody? Capital SUMMER 15, right? And you would have logged in as them, okay? So that kind of stuff happens all the time, and we see that constantly, and so you can use that information for pattern analysis and get in. So how do we find it? Well, search -credentials and Recon ING will show you all the modules that assist you in those areas. You will find the full suite of Pwn list stuff, which obviously costs some money, but I'm going to talk more about that here in a little bit. This particular Pwn list module right here is the one that just will give you kind of the yes/no. It doesn't cost anything. It's just a yes/no. It's been breached or it's been seen in a breach. Have I been pwned stuff from Troy Hunt? Most of you have probably been exposed to this by now. You can search his breach data and his pastes. So he's cataloging pastes from a bunch of different paste websites and allows you to search for usernames or email addresses in all of these pastes as well. So some pretty handy tools. Once again, these things say yes or no, and then the paste will actually give you a link to the paste. Okay. Another place you can go to start to see a little bit about breach details is privacyrights.org. If you haven't seen this, it's a pretty cool resource. It's where I go to look at details about breaches, regularly updated. I can zoom this in a little bit here. As you can see, the most recent one they've logged is September 17th, which wasn't all that long ago, and that was the Kardashian website. God help us all. Because look at how many people got hacked. 663,000 people have accounts on the Kardashian website? Man, we are going down the tubes, people. The end of humanity is near. But, you can search, which is kind of cool. You can just say, and you can get information about that particular dump. And the cool thing about it is they give regular updates and stuff like that, so you can stay on topic, and they also stay up to date with it. And they also give you links, like to the Krebs on Security article about it. It's a good place to harvest information about this, and you can actually go here and just search for the organization, search for the company name, and it'll come back and tell you if that company's been seen in a breach somewhere. So pretty handy resource there. Another one is the Was Company Hacked interface that Lenny Seltzer built on his website. Basically, it just goes out and it searches Twitter for the name of the company and then a bunch of hashtags that are like breached or hacked and all that other stuff. It's kind of neat. Sometimes the results are a little bit unpredictable, but it's another resource. And of course, just searching, right? Just going out there and using your search engines. So what's something else I'm looking for? I'm looking for technologies. I want to know about technologies and why. Specifically, or what am I looking for? Specifically, client and server-side technologies. I want to know what frameworks are being used. I want to know, the server architectures, anything I can get from a third-party resource about the underlying technologies being used, and then, of course, outdated software. So why are the technologies important? Well, because they facilitate other attack vectors. Once I have open source operating system command injection, or once I have SQL injection, it's really nice to know what system I'm actually injecting into, so that I can anticipate what that payload needs to be, or else I may end up with a false negative situation. And then, of course, with outdated software, we're talking about direct exploitation of the infrastructure, right? You see what version they're using, you go out to CVE details, then you go to exploit DB, try to find some live exploit code for it, and then you may be able to get access to that particular machine without ever seeing the application, or without ever having to go through the application. Another thing is server and client-side frameworks have all of their own vulnerabilities that are associated to only them. So .NET's got a certain set of vulnerabilities that are only associated with them. Angular.js has vulnerabilities that are only associated with Angular. And so if you know the kind of frameworks you're dealing with, you can go specifically look for those vulnerabilities. How do I do this? Well, I start with builtwith.com. Builtwith.com is scanning the internet constantly, looking at headers, analyzing server responses and all kinds of different stuff, fingerprinting server-side and client-side technologies. Obviously, it's pulling down all the code, so it's really easy to fingerprint client-side stuff. But it's fingerprint all that stuff. You just go there, you search for a domain, or you search for a specific host, and it'll tell you, hey, this is all the information I've seen about that particular host or domain. Another place you can go look is job openings. Okay, usually on the home page of the website, as you can see here, we have job openings at Invisium. So cheap plug real quick. If you're looking for a job in application security, please send us your resume. We would love to talk to you. But also third-party job sites. Okay, things like resume posting sites, stuff like that. Obviously, if company X is looking for elite PHP developer, well, then they're probably running PHP, right? And as we all know, at least as we figured out at Invisium, PHP is like the bane of most developers' existence. Okay, so vulnerabilities. Next category of information I'm looking for. What exactly am I looking for? Well, live exploitable vulnerabilities. Wouldn't that be awesome if I could find some exploitable vulnerabilities without ever sending a package to the environment? Source code leaks in things like news groups and forums, stuff like that. And then straight up searchable bugs. And I'll expand more on searchable bugs in a moment. Well, why? Because all of this results in really low or no effort vulnerability discovery. Somebody else has done the work for us. Somebody else has scanned the code. Somebody else has scanned the dynamic public-facing website, and maybe they've discovered some vulnerabilities and made them searchable for us. So we can just go out there and just pluck the information, and then bam, we've got some vulnerabilities. So some really quick wins. Well, how do I go about doing that? Well, online vulnerability scanners, right? Stuff like PunkSpider. Most of you have probably heard of PunkSpider by this point in time. They're scanning the internet for web applications and all the applications for vulnerabilities. I think they restrict themselves to certain TLDs. They're not doing too much in terms of .govs. At least they haven't in the past, and maybe now. But you can just go there and search by domain. Go to it and search Facebook.com, and you'll see any vulnerabilities it's tracking for Facebook.com. The last time it scanned it. Are there some false positives? Yeah, sure, there's some false positives there. It's an application security scanner. I mean, they're riddled with false positives, right? But you're not having to do the scanning. Somebody else babysat the scanner. Somebody else did the work, sat there and waited for it to finish. You just go search for the vulnerabilities. ASafe-A-Web, another Troy Hunt project. Basically what it does is it looks at .NET apps from a third-party perspective. Just go looks at your .NET apps, sends a series of tests to determine whether that application is vulnerable to any of those .NET-specific configuration issues. So a really useful tool there from a third-party perspective. Vulnerability disclosure sites. XSS was around for a long time. It has been taken over by XSS Pose. Not really sure why, but all the data has also been migrated over. So if you used to use XSS Pose is now the resource for that. But you just go there, once again, search for the domain, search for the host, and see if anybody's reported any cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in that application or in that domain. And then, of course, there's Zone H, which is kind of the hub for defacements. you can always go there and search as well to see if anything within your target domain has been defaced. Right? Which definitely means what? That there's been some level of exploitation on that particular server, and so then you can go hunting for it. So how do we do this? Well, first I go to search-vulnerabilities, and I see all the modules that do this for me in Recon NG, and so I've got modules that will go out and do the punk spider and XSS pose searches for you. The other stuff I do manually. Keep in mind that the app's got to be public-facing, right? And notice I had target here and I got it marked out. Well, that's because, a lot of times when we're testing in a UAT or a staging or some sort of test environment. Maybe it's not publicly accessible, but if there is a publicly accessible version of the application, well, then it can be seen by these scanners, okay? And that information may still be useful. And it's still within scope because you're not the one that's scanning it, right? The data's just out there. You're just going to get the data about it. So just because you're testing in a restricted environment doesn't mean that there's not information out there you can use about the production version of the application. So keep that in mind. So what about, and that was all about dynamic vulnerabilities. So what about static vulnerabilities? This goes back to that searchable bugs thing I was talking about. So how am I going to find static, like source code analysis type vulnerabilities out there on the internet for open source intelligence? Well, this is some of the favorite stuff I've been doing recently. There's a really cool out there called GitRob. It's a GitHub, and basically what it does is it will crawl. You give it an organization's name, and it will go to GitHub, and it will crawl for all the repositories that belong to that organization, and then it'll just pull down a list of file names, not the file contents, but it'll pull down a list of file names, and then it will look at all the file names to see if there's any known vulnerabilities associated with that particular file name, such as secret_token.rb, right? So things like that. Really cool idea, and it got me thinking. I'm like, well, this is neat. I bet we can take this a heck of a lot further. It's actually a modular framework. The only current module that exists is the one that analyzes file names, but it's extensible. So if you want to get involved in a project, something like this may be a good project for you to contribute to. Another really good place to look for bugs in code is a website called Search Code, and I've got it pulled up here. It's a fairly new project. I think it's been maybe a little over a year now. There's built with your search code. But you can, basically what he's doing is he's harvesting source code from a bunch of different repositories. You see the list there: GitHub, Bitbucket, Google Code, Codeplex, SourceForge, Fedora. And you can just go in and search them, right? Use search strings that are associated to known source code vulnerabilities in whatever framework you're testing. And if that particular repository is public facing, well, we can begin to do source code analysis without ever having to pull down the code. Most people would say, well, why don't you just pull down the code and run an actual source code analyzer against it? Well, what if your target organization's got 250 code repositories? You can do that for every single one of them? I'd rather just use a search engine and have it that's already done all the indexing and have it search it for me. So these are real approaches to how we can do this. Kind of a funny thing here. I was going through the GitRob code. And as you can see down there, what's he looking for in that particular snippet, that particular signature? For those of you that are familiar with Recon NG, he's looking for your API keys file. So if you push out like a fork of Recon NG with your API keys in it, yeah, somebody's going to find it using GitRob. I've done that before. You can't go find it because I rebased the entire repo. I think I actually wiped it out completely. But I've done that before. I've made that mistake. So we are all human and we make mistakes. So another way I do this is advanced searching using either GitHub or Google or both. Okay. So what do we call that? We call that dorking, right? Well, GitHub dorking is Google dorking using the GitHub advanced search engine, and so there's two different kinds of approaches that we can. Wow, it just got dark in here. Somebody hit a switch. There's a whole bunch of people standing back there. Somebody leaned up against the button. Anyway, I can keep talking because I have lights. So there's two different approaches to dorking. One, we can use GitHub's advanced search, or we can use Google's advanced search, with the cite:/github.com advanced search operator. There's some advantages and disadvantages to both. GitHub search forces you to include keywords. So even though you can do file name, and you can say, I want to look for a path, I'm sorry, not file name, but path to SSH/IDRSA, which is SSH public keys, right? Even though I can search for that, if I just put that in and hit enter, GitHub will say, no, we can't return anything. You need to put a string in there. So you have to put a string that will be, it's predictable, that will show up in that particular file every single time. Most of the time when we're searching for vulnerabilities, there's a string involved, right? So that's not really that much of a headache, but it is a restriction. Google Cite makes it a little bit harder to focus in on our target. Since we're already using cite:/github.com, the only way to really focus in on a target is by knowing the organization and by knowing the repository name and then using the in-URL thing you see on the bottom line of the slide there to focus in on a specific repository. Makes it a little bit more cumbersome to find those vulnerabilities using Google Dorks. I call the when I search GitHub through Google, I just kind of coined it Goo-Git Dorks, and I'm not trying to actually create a new word because we've got enough kinds of dorks out there. But they allow you for searching more than just GitHub, right? I mean, we can do it for cite bitbucket.com, cite sourceforge. Whatever it is now. It's been around forever. It's probably moved. There's Codeplex. There's a bunch of different resources there. So we're not just restricted to GitHub. But I've also found that the results are not nearly as reliable. Now, obviously, Google's having to index stuff, right? So if code's changing fairly regularly, fairly quickly, perhaps Google hasn't indexed it yet. So I have found that the results of searching for code vulnerabilities through GitHub through Google is less effective than just doing it straight through the GitHub Advanced Search Engine, okay? So, well, how do we do this? Well, search GitHub within the framework. We'll show you a couple new modules. We got the GitHub Miner, GitHub Repos, and the GitHub Dorks modules. And basically what those do is GitHub Miner will go out. It'll take all the organization names within the database. It'll pull down all the repositories and all the developer profiles for that organization. And that's absolutely key. One of the first places I start when I start doing reconnaissance for this sort of information is I want to know where the developer profiles are. So the GitHub Miner, and GitHub gives that information away. When you go to, say, newspring.cc, even though they have a private organization or they have organizational access controls that privatize a lot of their repos, you can still see all the developers that are associated with that organization. Pull down all their profiles because it'll be useful here in a bit. GitHub Repos will then take all of the profiles, all the GitHub profiles within the profiles table, and it will go pull down all of the repositories under those profiles, which includes both the ones associated with the organization and also the ones not associated with the organization, just all the ones that belong to that particular person. Once again, we're starting to expand our footprint here. And then GitHub Dorks will take all of the repositories that you've harvested and run those search strings against them. Okay. Right now, I've got a small Dorks file in there for GitHub. It's got like 6 or 7 different searches in there, but that's something that I think as a community we can definitely start to build. I went and I just combed through Google and the internet trying to find all the ones that people have been tweeting and talking about and writing articles about over the past few years, and just collected those. But obviously, there's room for expansion there. Okay. So very, very powerful here. So next thing I'm after is sensitive information, and we haven't completely left the GitHub stuff yet. Well, what am I after? Well, I'm after debugging information, any type of debugging information that a developer's left somewhere. Development notes, if they've done some development and left some notes somewhere out there on the internet, and then out-of-band configuration storage. And you're probably saying, who the heck puts that on the internet? Well, I'll explain why here in just a minute, or I'll explain how here in just a minute, because they do it completely on accident. It's actually pretty funny. So why? Well, obviously we can learn about the private repositories through information we see in public areas. So if there's debugging notes about them debugging an internal or an application that's hosted on an internal repository, we can begin to learn about that particular application. And then, of course, with configure, and the whole reason they're doing out-of-band configuration storage is because they don't want to push credentials to the code repository. And so, obviously, within that, we have credentials, possibly secret keys, possible API keys to third-party APIs, things of that sort. So some pretty darn sensitive information. Well, how do I go about finding it? Well, I look in pastes, and that's really hard. For those of you that try to search paste as a part of your OSINT methodology, you know that those things are like the actual search capability built within paste websites is like a flicker in time. It's like you get to search the past 300, and that was about 90 seconds worth of pastes. So unless you're Troy Hunt and you're continually scraping and pulling down and cataloging all those pastes, darn near impossible to search effectively. So that's really hard to search pastes and find that information. But we have gists. How many people here use gists? GitHub gists. One guy. All right, this is cool. All right. So you'll probably know what I'm talking about when I get to this. Others will be like, what? All right, so devs treat them like pastes. Right? If developers are already operating within the context of GitHub, and GitHub has this really neat pastes feature where I can put debugging information there, or I can put configuration information there and share it with the other developers, why wouldn't I use that instead of go to a third-party paste site? Well, I don't blame you for using it at all. But the key is that GitHub doesn't allow for organizational gists, right? So your organizational account cannot create gist. There's no gist associated with it, which means all of the access controls that come with having an organizational account don't protect any gists. So the gists and gists are public by default. So when that developer goes and creates a gist based on some sensitive information about an application, that gist goes to their public-facing account and by default is public. Okay? I have found so many sets of credentials, sensitive information, all of this stuff, the debugging code, API keys and stuff, in gist, just simply by harvesting all those developer profiles, going to each one of them, clicking on gist, and just seeing what's there. And there's a ton of stuff in there. Developers don't realize that when they're, you could be sitting there operating within the private access control restricted repository and say, well, I'm going to create a gist about this. Gist, it goes to their public profile by default. Okay? So that's definitely something you want to start looking at. And what do? Well, we pull the gist down, and then we just start searching for keywords. And the kind of keywords that you want to search for here are stuff like anything that you would search for, say, if you were doing post-exploitation on a machine, right? We're looking for passwords. We're looking for database connection strings, looking for maybe just commands, like actual commands on a command line, things of that sort. A lot of times there's not something specific you can look for. You just go scrolling through them and look at them. But what do I use within Recon NG? The gist module. All right, so I've got one in there, gist search, that will take all of the gist. So when you actually do the GitHub repo module, it not only pulls down repositories for each of those profiles, it pulls down all their gists too. And then this module will go through and search all of those gists based on a list of keywords that you give it. Very, very powerful. Definitely check it out. Okay. Google Hacking Database. We've all heard of this before, right? What can Google Dorking do for us? Those of you that have messed with this, and you probably had to do it manually because the tools that do it in an automated fashion no longer exists. But they can lead to all kinds of cool stuff. You can get some really neat error messages, which dump a whole bunch of neat information. Contacts, live vulnerabilities if they're running something that's searchable, credentials, files, as we saw in the Metacrawler module, all kinds of neat stuff. And there's a whole lot of sources for dorks, right? I mean, you've got the Google Hacking Database, which is hosted by the offensive security guys, used to be hosted over at Johnny Long's website. The Anonymous, they published their SQLite Google Dorks list a couple of years ago. If you trust actually going out and downloading that thing, it's out there. You can grab it. That's an interesting set of dorks to look for SQL injection. The GooGit dorks, all of the different GitHub dorks that are out there that leverage Google. And then, of course, custom lists, right? I mean, I've got my own custom list of application security-focused Google dorks that, I use when I go out and I search for them. All right? But it's not limited to just Google, right? We can do this in Bing. We can do this in Yahoo. We can do this in a lot of different places. And there's also the Bing Hacking Database available from the Bishop Fox folks that do the search diggity stuff. But guess what? I've mastered, I think I've owned Google at this point. I've got the Google Hacking Database working within Recon NG. It's something I've wanted to do since I started building this out 3 years ago. But anybody that's ever tried to scrape Google knows, I mean, it's hard. Like, they do a lot to prevent third parties from scraping their content. But I found a way to do it. Okay, and I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of details about how I do it. The code's out there if you want to take a look. But I've got it to where I can search it now. Okay, and so I've got a module that I've built for that called GHDB, obviously Google Hacking Database module, and it will go out and it will take all these Google dorks, it will associate them with the domain, and so that you're actually targeting your scope, and it will respond with all of the different hits. Okay, and you probably ask, well, how do you get by the bot prevention, right? How do you get by the captchas? Well, why don't we demonstrate and I'll show you how. Okay, so going in here, let's load the Google Hacking Database. And right off the bat, I just want to go and show you the options for this model. Oh, that looks ugly. There we go. Better. Let me bump it up to the top so people in the back can see. All right, so immediately you'll see that they've got a whole list of different dork categories here. So what it does is, and God bless the offensive security folks, they manage this product, they maintain it. They put in all the overhead to take the submissions and format them in a way that fits into the Google Hacking Database, and they provide access to that to me as an open source project, as somebody that runs an open source project, so that I can build this thing. So definitely huge shout out to the offensive security guys and Mutts in particularly. But anyway, what I do is I parse the entire Google hacking database, and I separate all of the different dorks into categories. And so you don't want to search for all like 3,700 dorks for each domain. That would take forever. But you may want to focus in on one particular area. And so let's say I want to just search for error messages. So I can set Google hacking database, error messages to true. So just set the flag to true. And now I'm searching for just those. Notice the little dorks thing up at the top. If you want to use your own custom list, you just set dorks to the path of the file, and it'll ignore all the Google hacking database stuff and use your list. Okay? But here I want to use the Google hacking database, and I want to search for error messages, and it'll do it for the domain. So I go ahead and I run. And as long as I'm still connected to the internet, good. Okay. We'll let it go, and Google's like, okay, you're not a bot. You're, at least not yet, you're not. You're still human. We'll give this a minute. Yeah, I did this demo a little while ago, or a couple of weeks ago, and like it took like 3 runs for Google to finally say, okay, you're a bot. So hopefully it won't take that long this time. But basically what you're going to see eventually is you're going to see my desktop flip over and an image pop up on the screen. And that image will be the CAPTCHA. And then what Recon NG gives you the ability to do is enter the CAPTCHA within the framework. It will communicate with Google to retrieve your, oh, there it is. So there you see your CAPTCHA, okay? Rock on, right? Any takers on how long it's going to take before this doesn't work anymore? Yeah, that probably completely ruined it by talking about it. But that looks like PSILSO. So let's go over here and say PSILSO. You hit enter, and if I did it right, it actually gets faster, right? So I get the cookie. I get the I am a human cookie from Google, right? And now I pass that cookie to it, and it says, okay, you're definitely human. Search as fast as you want. So I go gangbusters on this thing. It works a lot faster when you're not over like 2 bars of AT&T cellular. But yeah, so it works well. And you can see I'm getting hits, right? Warning, cannot modify header information. I mean, one of these things when you go to the website, like there's PHP errors or something, not PHP, but maybe it is PHP, I can't remember exactly. There's legitimate errors in there, stuff that could honestly lead to possible vulnerabilities. And so this stuff works. And one thing I've noticed is you're not going to be able to do this forever. It'll come back and make you answer a CAPTCHA again. But I've noticed that the more difficult the CAPTCHA is, the longer, like the more requests you'll get to make before it asks you again. Okay? Like this one right here, I'm not even going to try. I mean, what is that? Goodness, yeah. That one would let me make a lot of requests. Okay? But I'm just going to jump out of this now because I think, I've shown you, you've seen how it works. Pretty cool stuff. I'm super excited about this. It's been an awesome capability that I've been trying to build into this for a long time, and it's finally here. Okay? So, some final thoughts on this. One thing that'll probably make most people happy, a lot of times in past talks, I've gotten through all this really cool stuff, and then I'm like, guess what? This costs 60 grand. Well, guess what? This is everything I've done today, free, right? In fact, the only thing you need to do is get an API key for GitHub. Nothing costs any money. Everything I do for OSINT application security, besides maybe obviously pulling down Polarization credentials, is going to cost some money. But everything else that I've done today, 100% free, doesn't cost you anything. Okay, and that's really cool. Second thing, help me build out these lists, right? So I've done what I can to scrape the internet for these GitHub advanced searches and stuff like that. If you've got stuff that you use on a daily basis or things you've used in the past, please help me expand the list. You can email them to me, or you can send them as pull requests out to the framework. Either one works, and however you can get it to me is fine. Tweet them, I don't care. Once again, shout out to the guys at Offensive Security for maintaining and providing us access to that Google hacking database. They also allow me to make regular requests for it to keep it updated. So every time I push out a new update to Recon NG, you'll get an updated version of that Google hacking database. And then also want to announce something new. I just got permission to announce this over the past 24 hours. I'm going to start providing Recon NG as a service. There's a lot of folks that have said, look, I can't afford, as a boutique firm or as an individual that has clients, I can't afford to get all of the API access required to do a lot of the things that you do. And so as a private contractor, I'm going to start providing that as a service to folks. So if you want somebody to do all the Recon NG stuff for you, you contract with me, and as a consultant, I'll sit there, I'll go through a couple hours, do all the OSINT for you, build out the workspace, and then send you the workspace, and you can move on from there. Kind of making some of that more expensive stuff accessible to everyone, but doing it in a way that I feel is ethical without breaching any of those ethical boundaries. So if you're interested in that, by all means, please come up to me afterward, get a card, give me a card. I'd love to work with you on that. And then also, if you don't already know it, if you like what you see here and you want to get more into AppSec, in November up in Charlotte, North Carolina, I'm going to be teaching my PWAPT class for $250. You're never going to get it that cheap anywhere. All right, for those of you that took it here, you pay probably 4 times as much, and that's okay because DerbyCon's awesome and it's totally worth the other $750 or whatever it was. But yeah, so I mean, like if you go to the Black Hat, it costs you like $4 or $5 grand. You go, here, it costs you a couple grand. $250 for 2 days of awesome application security training. So I encourage you to come out. AppSec.rocks will take you straight to my training page. Yeah, I don't know how I ended up with that domain, but it's pretty awesome, isn't it? Okay, so with that, I am done with the presentation just in time. Are there any questions? And if you want some information about me, Twitter, follow, email me if you need to get a hold of me, envision me if you need some work done, and so on and so forth. Thank you. And if we run out of time in here, I'll just kind of go back there outside the door and we can talk if anybody's interested. Anybody still writing this stuff down? Otherwise, I'm pulling the plug.